It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the AOC Q3279VWFD8. This video accompanies a longer and more detailed written review. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. As usual, this video does not show you exactly what the monitor will look like firsthand. It's not possible to show you that because what you see depends on my camera, it depends on processing done by YouTube, my video software, and ultimately it depends on the output of your own monitor. This monitor uses a 31.5-inch IPS type panel, so that's a key difference to the older model, the Q3279VWF without the D8 at the end, which used a VA panel. Another key difference is that this uses a medium matte anti-glare screen surface rather than a glossy screen surface. And some of the key sort of differences in terms of the image clarity and the perceived vibrancy, that's explored a little later on in the review. But some users will quite like this change because it does mean that you don't get annoying reflections on the screen, and glare handling is good on this model. But on the other side, there's a little bit of a graininess to the image and you don't get quite the same perceived vibrancy. But there are some differences that this model has in its favour, which sort of counteract some of the differences in perceived vibrancy to a large extent, and I'll explore all of that later on. In terms of the screen size, I find it good for a sort of immersive experience on a desk. I sit around 70 to 80 centimetres from a screen of this size typically, and I find that it sort of fills my field of vision up fairly nicely. Certainly nicer than a smaller model, say a 27-inch model from the same kind of viewing distance. The resolution 2560 by 1440 or WQHD delivers a decent pixel density on a screen of this size as well. It's not an amazing pixel density, certainly compared to some screens, and it's not as tight as on a 27-inch WQHD model, but it's similar to a 24-inch Full HD model, so it's not a bad pixel density by any means. This means you get a decent sort of level of detail in games. Nothing amazingly spectacular in that respect, but not terrible either. And you also get a decent amount of useful workspace on the desktop. So you can see there's quite a lot of white space on this on my website here. And that's an indication that the pixel density is good, and it's also an indication that you could use the monitor for quite effective multitasking. So you could be working on a document whilst also looking at a website, or you could be doing what I do quite frequently, watching a video on Netflix whilst also looking at stuff on the internet. So it's quite good in terms of the real estate you have at your disposal. Good for productivity. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. The design is exactly the same as the predecessor to this model, the Q3279VWF without the D8 at the end. It has glossy black plastic bezels. As you might know from my previous videos, I'm not a massive fan of this sort of shiny fingerprint magnet glossy look to things, but it's alright, I can live with it. The stand base has a quite shallow rectangular appearance, so it doesn't take up a lot of desk space, which is nice for a monitor of this size. It means you can put it quite close to the wall, and it has a kind of brushed matte silver look to the top of the stand base. So overall it's a fairly simple design. It's pretty unfussy. There's nothing that people will really dislike. Some monitors have quite divisive design features. This one doesn't really have any of that. The bezels, which I mentioned, glossy black plastic, they're moderately thick, and they pretty much cover all of the panel border. So it's not a dual stage design, so you don't get a kind of panel border around the image. The image comes quite close to the inner edge of the bezel. The screen surface is a big difference from the predecessor to this model. So instead of being a glossy or very low haze matte anti-glare with sort of a 3% haze value or whatever it was, this monitor has a medium matte anti-glare screen surface, so it handles glare a lot better. You don't get reflections, but it does have a bit of a knock-on impact to the image quality, as I explore a little later on. At the side, there's not a lot to the monitor really. It doesn't have any extra ports at the side or anything like that. It has predominantly the glossy black plastic look to it. It's fairly thin at the thinnest point, and it lumps out centrally towards where the stand attaches. The included stand offers tilt as the only ergonomic flexibility, so you can tilt the monitor backwards a bit and also forwards a very small amount. At the rear of the monitor you can see that there's glossy black plastic towards the bottom and a brushed effect matte black plastic towards the top. The stand neck has a kind of silver semi-matte or satin look to it and has some glossy plastic at the sides as well. Ports face backwards. There's an AC power input, so the monitor uses an internal power converter. There's a DVI dual link port, HDMI 1.4A, which supports AMD FreeSync on compatible GPUs and systems, DisplayPort 1.2A, which supports AMD FreeSync on compatible GPUs and systems, a VGA port, and a 3.5mm headphone jack. There's also a Kensington lock slot just there. I'm now running Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This is a particularly good test for contrast because there are lots of dark caverns and caves and dark areas in the game with good contrasting light elements in between. This scene in particular has lots of light and dark mixed together, so it's a good test for contrast. I'm using a different camera to what I usually use, and I've been experimenting a bit with how to set it up, but I don't think I've quite got it perfect for this kind of testing yet, so hopefully things will look alright in the video. But as I always say, what you see depends on many things other than this particular monitor, so it's more to guide me through what I see. And in terms of contrast, this monitor actually has impressive static contrast for an IPS type panel, even following the adjustments made to my test settings, so sort of calibrating it through the OSD. It had a contrast ratio of around 1300 to 1, which is very pleasing for the panel type. It's not sort of up to the levels of VA or anything like that, and certainly if you compare to this model's predecessor, which had a contrast ratio exceeding 5000 to 1, there's really no comparison in that respect. Also, being an IPS type panel, it does have IPS glow, so you can see towards the corners of the screen when you look at darker elements that there's a kind of bloom, but this does lighten up the dark areas a bit, gives a kind of bloom effect, and it eats away at some of the subtle details. But for the central area of the screen, and certainly if you're observing the monitor in more sensible lighting conditions, I'm in a sort of pitch black room here, I definitely wouldn't recommend that, even with a reasonably decent VA panel, because you don't really get inky depth. But certainly in more sensible lighting conditions and considering the more central areas of the screen, there's a nice contrast between the dark elements and the light elements. This fire here, these very bright sort of artificial light sources as well. They're nice and bright and do contrast well with the darker surroundings. So I'd say that overall it's sort of roughly as you'd expect from the panel type, but it does have a little bit stronger static contrast. It doesn't really do anything revolutionary for the contrast, but does give it a little bit of an edge compared to most IPS panels. I'm now going to talk about colour reproduction, and I like to start this off by looking at the Lagom tests for viewing angles rather than jumping straight into a game, because this can highlight weaknesses in a better way and a more specific way than games can. The monitor does use an IPS type panel, so it does have relatively strong colour consistency. For example, with the Lagom text test, it looks largely blended, and with a VA panel you'd get a kind of cone of blendedness in the middle and more colourful towards the outside, and that cone would move as you move the camera. On TN models you'd get an obvious sort of gradient flash between green and red and orange, and it's not anything like that. Having said that, it doesn't look completely blended together. There are some hints of colour. For example, there's sort of a slight reddy look to the striping of the text towards the left and a green look towards the right, particularly towards the top of the screen. And if you shift your viewing angle, this does actually change a bit. It might not come out very clearly on the video, but by eye you can see some shifts between the red and the green. But again, they're not strong saturated shifts. They just indicate that there's a slight viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. And although I don't really show it in this video, I do talk a bit or show you in the viewing angles video that accompanies the review. The off-angle performance of this monitor, I can show you now, is a little weaker than you'd expect from an IPS type panel. It's partly due to the large size, but it's also due to some weaknesses in the panel type, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the in-game testing. But the purple block here, again, don't know how it's going to look in the video, but to my eye, it actually looks pretty consistent. However, it does have a slightly sort of darker look towards the outer area of the image, and it has a more pink hue towards the central region. And if you move closer to the screen, this difference becomes more pronounced, more extreme. I tend to sit around 70 to 80 centimeters from the screen, and from this viewing position, things are pretty consistent, but there's just a slight sort of change if you look at the perimeter. For the red tone, this is less obvious. Not that it was massively obvious with the purple shade, but it's pretty consistent, rich red throughout, really. But it does look slightly darker towards the extreme flanks of the screen, and that's even when he's sitting fairly far away from the monitor. If he's sitting closer to the monitor, sort of below 60 centimeters, then again this difference becomes a bit more pronounced. For the green block, there's really nothing to complain about. Consistent green, quite solid, has less of a yellow hue than on monitors that track the sRGB colour space very closely, because it does have a bit of extension beyond that. Same with the blue block, it's really quite consistent. There aren't any massive issues there. So overall, it's clearly an IPS type panel and much stronger than VA or TN in terms of the colour consistency, but there are some weaknesses compared to the strongest IPS type panels. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider again. I've used this instead of Battlefield 1 for colour reproduction in the video, just for a little bit of variety, because I think people who watch my videos a lot are probably quite sick of seeing Battlefield 1, and I thought I'd just give them something a bit different. I'm also going to be testing Battlefield 5 in the not too distant future on videos, so give you something a little bit different in the meantime. The colour reproduction of this monitor is pleasing overall. As I showed you in the Lagom viewing angles tests, there are some slight weaknesses that you might not expect from an IPS type panel. Part of this is due to the fact that it's such a large screen, and typically when I test IPS type panels they're not this large, but it's also partly because there are some weaknesses in viewing angle and colour consistency compared to some IPS type models with, for example, Samsung PLS panels, AU Optronics AHVA panels, and LG Displays IPS panels. Because this uses a BOE IPS type panel, and it doesn't quite have the same performance. However, it is still clearly an IPS type panel. The viewing angle performance, when you compare, for example, to the predecessor to this model, which uses a VA panel, colours are far more consistent. This model also has a generous colour gamut, which extends well beyond sRGB. It doesn't extend as far as traditional wide gamuts, such as Adobe RGB, but it does actually offer good Adobe RGB coverage. I think it was about 89%. And basically this means that you get more saturated and more vibrant look to the image compared to monitors which track the sRGB colour space more closely. And many users will actually really like this. It doesn't have an extreme sort of cartoonish oversaturation, and it's quite balanced in the gamut, so it doesn't just extend off in the green region but not much in the red region as you'd get with Adobe RGB. So it's more balanced in its extra saturation, and with the strong consistency of the IPS type panel, certainly stronger than other non-IPS LCD panel types, it does deliver a nice rich look throughout the screen, a nice vibrant look throughout the screen, and it kind of just brings games like this to life. There's a really nice sort of lushness to some of these deep greens, and there were some nice more muted greens in the mix as well, which do look relatively muted compared to the more sort of eye-catching greens, and it gives a fairly natural look to the forest. As I've said, there's a little bit of extra saturation, but then again the sRGB colour space is very restrictive, and there are plenty of green shades you'd see in a real forest that aren't captured in sRGB anyway. There's also lots of nice golden earthy browns, and for the most part these have a good neutral look to them. There's a little bit of a red push, a little bit too much of a red hue to some of the brown shades. For example, this tree here looks a little bit more red than it should, and again, that's not going to come out on the video necessarily, but it's only a slight push. It doesn't look completely stupid. And also Laura's skin, it doesn't look sunburnt because it's not extreme in the red tint, but it does look a little bit, I'd say, a bit more tan than she actually should be. But overall, I really do like the colour reproduction of this monitor, and certainly compared to the previous model, the colour consistency and the colour gamut is more generous, so it does provide a richer look overall. And as I've mentioned, the screen surface differences, I actually forgot to mention this in the contrast section. I was sort of too busy looking at my camera and the settings I was using, so I'm sorry about that. But what I would say about the screen surface, in terms of perceived vibrancy, the overall sort of look to the image, because of the colour gamut, is actually it's actually richer and more vibrant than the older model. The older model did of course have stronger contrast, and the glossy screen surface did help with perceived vibrancy in some lighting conditions, but this model still has a good pop to it because of the colour gamut and the consistent colours from the IPS type panel. I didn't mention the contrast section, but the screen surface does give a bit of a grainy look to the image. It's not a heavy smeary graininess, but if you compare to the older model, which had a very smooth look to the image, when you're looking at lighter areas such as the sky up here, it does have a kind of slightly hazy look to it. It almost looks like there's a small amount of mist in the air. But again, it's not a sort of heavy smeary graininess, and I'm actually very sensitive to this, so I think most users wouldn't really have an issue with this at all. I'm now running Battlefield 1 again, but I've now got my obnoxiously loud AMD GPU in my system, so you can undoubtedly hear that annoying thrashing noise. The monitor features a 75Hz refresh rate. This gives you two main advantages over a 60Hz monitor, or indeed running this monitor at 60Hz. And provided you've got a suitably high frame rate as well, so you can see in the top right corner of the screen I've got everything running at 75 frames a second at the moment. The first thing this does is that it improves the connected feel, and that describes the sort of precision and fluidity you feel when you're interacting with the game. This is separate to input lag, and it's linked to refresh rate, and users who are sensitive to this will certainly feel an advantage as refresh rate and frame rate is increased. But this model does actually have very low input lag as well. You can see the exact figure in the written review, but it was below 3 milliseconds, so there's really no complaints at all in terms of input lag on this model from me, and even users who are sensitive to that should find it just fine. The other aspect that this increased frame rate and refresh rate helps with is that it decreases perceived blur. There are two main elements of perceived blur, and this is a concept which is explored in some detail in an article on responsiveness on our website, and also summarised in the written review quite nicely, so definitely check that out if you're not familiar with the concept. But basically, the perceived blur due to eye movement is decreased when you increase the refresh rate and frame rate of the content. So compared to 60Hz, there's a bit of a decrease in perceived blur due to eye movement. The other aspect is pixel responsiveness, and that's really very strong on this monitor. It's in fact one of the sort of key differences between this model and its predecessor, because the predecessor to this monitor had some very sluggish pixel transitions. VA panels are known for that kind of thing, but the original Q3279VWF was actually, even for a modern VA panel, was quite slow in that respect. So there's some obvious smeary trailing. You don't get any of that on this model. It gives a really competent 75Hz performance. There are some very slight weaknesses, so slight they're barely worth mentioning, but I'll go through them anyway, just for completeness. And I write a little bit more about these in the written review, but they're really very slight weaknesses that most users aren't going to notice. One thing is there's a little bit of powdery trailing for some transitions, especially where there are darker shades involved, but you don't see anything like the smearing that you get on the old model. It's just a really very faint powder, which sort of, you can see it, well, you won't be able to see it on the video because it's really very faint. Even to my eye, to my sensitive eye, and I'm looking out for it, it doesn't catch my eye at all, so it's not worth worrying about. And for some transitions there's a very small amount of overshoot as well. There's a very small amount of what I call snail slime trailing. That's just a phrase I've coined to describe it because I think it's quite descriptive. It's kind of this slightly semi-transparent look to the trailing rather than a blend of the background and foreground colour. So you can see it between sort of various lighter shades or lighter and slightly darker shades. the wall against the sky and certain elements of the sky. You can see it a little bit, but again, it's not eye-catching, it's actually very faint, and this is just a sort of isolated example where I could find any of this at all. It's really not going to bother the vast majority of users. Even users who are sensitive to overshoot are unlikely to find this bothersome, and most users are not likely to notice it even when they're looking out for it. But I do like to mention these things for completeness. I should also mention I'm using the lowest overdrive setting of the monitor. I'm not going to go through these here. They're explored in enough detail in the written review, and you're not really going to see an awful lot of difference in the video. But even the lowest overdrive setting is really very good, very effective grey to grey acceleration, and all you do when you increase that is you start introducing more obvious overshoot. So I'd recommend just leaving it set to off. The weak setting is really quite similar to this, and by all means have a play around and try the weak setting as well. It's alright, but any higher than that's really quite pointless on this monitor. The other aspect of this monitor is that it supports AMD FreeSync for compatible AMD GPUs and systems. For most of my testing I've actually used an NVIDIA GPU, and FreeSync is the only feature which you don't get as an NVIDIA user. This monitor works absolutely fine with an NVIDIA GPU, and you can run it at the 75Hz refresh rate, no problem at all. But FreeSync is something which you can't use as an NVIDIA user. And I've got a solid 75 frames a second at the moment, but if I were to increase the graphics settings, and obviously the exact graphics settings depend on the game you're playing and your GPU and system in general as to what frame rate you'd be getting, but it's now below 70. It sort of fluctuates a bit around 70 frames a second, but with FreeSync you don't get any tearing or stuttering from that mismatch. So usually if you have FreeSync disabled, you get, to me, obvious stuttering if you've got VSync on, or obvious tearing if you've got VSync off, with these kind of refresh rate and frame rate mismatches. So I find them very jarring, and I really like not having them. If I increase the graphics settings further so that my frame rate drops even more, FreeSync still does its thing. You can see it's dropped to around 50 frames a second now. And I would say that I do notice a decrease of connected feel, and that's just because the frame rate itself is lower, because low frame rates are still low frame rates regardless of FreeSync, but you don't get that tearing or stuttering from the mismatches, which is really nice. The floor of FreeSync operation on this monitor is 48 Hz. So that means if your frame rate drops below 48 frames a second, FreeSync deactivates. There's no LFC, low frame rate compensation, because that would require at least the floor to be sort of half of the ceiling, if that makes sense. So with this, you've got a ceiling of 75 Hz and a floor of 48, so it just doesn't work with LFC. Doesn't enable at all. But if you do happen to get frame rates drop below that 48 frames a second, so I've got 44, 45, 43 at the moment, FreeSync deactivates, and I can now see obvious stuttering, and it's really quite jarring to me. Sensitivity to this does vary between individual users, but these frame rates and refresh rates I'm talking about here, they are relatively low if you compare to high refresh rate and high frame rate monitors, for example 144 Hz monitors, and that does mean that the tearing and the stuttering indeed can be more obvious. So if I had VSync disabled, the tearing would really do my head in, but that's because I'm quite sensitive to it myself. To wrap up then, the overall design of this monitor, very similar to its predecessor. So it has a kind of glossy dust magnet bezel. I'm not a massive fan of that kind of material, but I can live with it. It doesn't really bother me too much. Fairly simple design really. No sort of ultra slender bezels or anything like that. There's just a single stage design there. Fairly simple stand base. It doesn't take up too much of the depth on the desk, which is quite useful given the size of the screen. And the size of the screen itself is good in terms of giving you a nice level of immersion when you're playing games or watching movies, and it gives you a good level of desktop real estate, and when combined with the 2560 by 1440 resolution, delivers a decent pixel density, and it does give you plenty of useful workspace. The contrast performance of the monitor is quite good actually for the panel type. If you're comparing it to a good VA model like the predecessor to this monitor, then I'm afraid the contrast performance is quite disappointing. But if you draw a more appropriate comparison, which would be to other IPS type panels, it's actually quite good. It has a static contrast even after full tweaking or calibration of around 1300 to 1, which is really very strong for an IPS type panel. It does have some IPS glow, a moderate amount, fairly normal amount actually for the panel type and one of this size. So it's not a low glow panel, it's not a particularly high glow panel, it's really quite average in that respect. But that does eat away at some of the detail peripherally, and if you like to watch content in a dark room, then the predecessor to this model is going to give you a much better performance in that respect. The screen surface is also quite different to the predecessor to this model, because this one uses a medium matte anti-glare screen surface rather than a very low haze or essentially glossy screen surface. It means that the image is not quite as smooth or pure, it has a bit of a graininess to it, although nothing like a heavy smeary graininess which some matte screen surfaces display. On the flip side, it offers much more effective glare handling, so you don't get reflections on the screen, and you can use it in a wider variety of lighting conditions without worrying quite so much about your lighting environment. The colour reproduction of this model, it's again different to its predecessor for two reasons. The IPS type panel delivers very consistent colours. There were some slight changes in the colour representation at the extreme edges of the screen, and that's partly due to the sheer size of the panel, but also due to some slight viewing angle related weaknesses and slight weaknesses in colour consistency. But I emphasise the fact that they are slight weaknesses. The colours are certainly a lot more consistent than you see on a VA or TN model. The monitor also has a generous colour gamut. It's not as generous as some models, it's not a wide gamut, and it's not sort of DCI P3 or anything like that, but it is well beyond sRGB, and that does give you extra saturation, so it gives you a kind of vibrant look. That's the kind of look that many users will really like, and it kind of suits the general purpose use of this monitor, which it's really intended for. It also has an effective sRGB emulation mode, and this cuts down on the colour gamut nicely, but you would have to fully calibrate it using a colorimeter, because otherwise your white point and other things are slightly off in that respect. But regardless of this, it's always best if you're using a monitor for colour critical work to do your own calibration and recalibration with your own colorimeter. For sort of general purpose use though, I think the colour gamut of this works nicely. It gives a nice varied and vibrant palette of colours. In terms of responsiveness, this monitor is in a completely different league to its predecessor. It offers very low input lag, really very little input lag. It has a 75 Hz refresh rate, which it puts to very good use. It has pixel responses even using its lowest overdrive setting, which for the most part are absolutely fine for really decent, solid 75 Hz performance. There are only some very minor weaknesses, and they're so minor I'm not even going to reiterate them again because most users aren't going to notice them. So really it offers a very solid 75 Hz performance. It also offers AMD FreeSync for compatible GPUs and systems, and that worked exactly as you'd hope it does to combat tearing and stuttering from refresh rate and frame rate mismatches. That works between 48 and 75 Hz, so it could of course have a broader FreeSync range in an ideal world, but for a 75 Hz monitor the sort of FreeSync range doesn't generally go much below that. So clearly this monitor ticks a lot of boxes, there's a lot to like about it, and one thing you really have to like about it is the price tag. At time of doing this review, it's sort of hovering around $200, £200, maybe a little bit over depending on where you look and when you look. But either way, it's really excellent value for what you get with this large screen and good colour reproduction, nice vibrant colours if you like that kind of thing, really decent contrast performance, good responsiveness. So it really does offer a lot of value for money. That's all there is to the AOC Q3279VWFD8. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.